Hi, this is Josh from Rego Consulting. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to use the cost diagram to troubleshoot and investigate fallout in your cost model. So here from the metrics tab, I'm going to select the cost object and then the diagram dropdown. So this diagram gives us a visual representation of our cost model and shows all of the relationships that help drive costs through this model. So here at the bottom, you'll see 4.7 million is going into our cost model at the cost source object. And then it moves through the model, through all the different allocations and objects that have been created, until it eventually gets top of our model to business units. And here you can see 4.3 million is making it to the top of our model. So that means we have about 500,000 in fallout somewhere in our model. So what we can do here, this cost model diagram is really helpful identifying this fallout because it lets you easily select any object and then see the percent of allocation. So here we can see our labor object is 100% allocated. We can look at our fixed assets object and see it's 100% allocated. If we choose our cost source object, we see it's 98% allocated. So we know there's a little fallout here. And if we look at the top, we can see 81,000 is unassigned from the cost source object. So we've identified some of our fallout right here. So if we scroll over, we can see here's the unique identifier for this specific fallout. We can also, if we wanted to, do some show hide columns and then pull in other columns from our master data set. This is not necessarily the best way to troubleshoot this fallout now, but this would be really helpful if we were looking to trace costs through our model. In this case, we're going to look to see why this 81,000 is not being allocated by going into the modeled step. And you can do that by double-clicking the cost source object like I did. So here in this case, we can see here's our 81,000. So let's look to see what this is made up of. Here again is the unique identifier for that 81,000. We can see the cost pool is outside services, the sub pool is managed service provider. But let's pull in a few other columns to figure out where this should be going. Now we know in the cost source object, our allocations are really going into fixed assets, labor, vendor objects, and then most of the remaining will go through your outside or your other cost pools. So let's see, this is not depreciation, so we know it shouldn't be going to fixed assets. It's not labor, so it shouldn't be going to our labor object, but it is vendors. So it should most likely be going to our vendor object. Looking here, we have two different allocations to vendors. So let's look at this first one here and determine if it should be going through here. The easy way to do this is I'm going to get the unique identifier for this specific row, and then I'll paste that in up here so that we can isolate it. So now here's the 81,000, and we can see that it is not being allocated through this allocation. So let's look at the rules being applied for this allocation. So in this case, it's looking for vendor ID is not null, so that's good there. Our cost pool does not contain labor, which it does not. Our sub pool does not contain depreciation, so it does not. And our application ID is null. In this case, the application ID is not null, so this row, this amount, should not be allocating through this row. It's not intended to allocate through this allocation. So let's look at our other vendors allocation and see if it's intended to go through this one. So again, we'll isolate that specific amount and then look at the rules for this allocation. We see vendor ID is not null. We know that's not null. The application ID is not null, and in this case it's not null. So if we look at the subpool, does not contain depreciation, which it does not. We'll check that already. So it does look like this is the allocation that this amount is intended to go through. So let's move further down the steps here and figure out why it's not moving through here. So in this case, the data relationships between the cost source and the destination, which is the vendor's master data set, the rules are application ID and vendor ID. So these are the columns that have to match between both data sets for this amount to go through. So here, let's look at the application ID and see if this ID exists in the vendor master data set. And it does, so it should be matching on application ID. So let's check vendor ID now to see if this vendor exists. And it does not. So this is showing us that even though in the vendor's master data set, some vendors are assigned this application ID, this specific vendor for this cost is not. So to get this to allocate, we would need to go into our vendor's master data set and update it to include this vendor ID for this vendor. Once that update is done in the vendor master data set, it is likely that this amount would then go through and then the cost source object would be 100% allocated. So I hope you found this helpful. This is Josh from Rego Consulting. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us or visit regoconsulting.com.